Hi, everyone. My name is Priyanka. I am the staff lawyer at Greenpeace Canada. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Just a bit of background about myself. As I mentioned, I'm in-house counsel and I handle everything legal, which includes how legislation can shape our response to climate change and how we deal with environmental injustices and crises through the law. So I'm really excited to talk to you today and talk about a green, equitable economic recovery from COVID-19 and what that could look like. I think a lot of us are searching for a lot of positive news and ways we can make our differences, no matter how big or small, during this difficult time. So thank you so much for making time and space to join this conversation. So here to share their ideas, experience, and analysis with us are our amazing panelists. I'm just going to get you to wave and say your name so people know who you are. I'm going to start with Brittany, and then Kelsey, and then Ananda. So Brittany?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Brittany Andrew-Amofah.
Hi there. My name is Salem. I think I'm not showing up on the Salem, here from Vancouver, Squamish Nation.
Hi, my name is Ananda Lee Tan. I'm a resident here on the lands of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam.
Thanks for joining us. So just to get things started, I'd like to turn things over to our panelists to say a bit about themselves, your background, where you come from, the communities you live in, and the work that you're doing now. So we'll turn it over to Kelsey and then go to Brittany and then Ananda.
Hi, everybody. So for those who don't know me, my name is Salem, and I'm an elected councillor, and I do a lot of work in climate with my nation, and have been an elected councillor for 2 years, and just over 2 years. I'm also appointed to the BC Climate Council and by the provincial government and working on implementing the Clean BC plan as well as some further measures. And also just really interested in progressive policy and how to implement that, and specifically a lot of how to implement that within Indigenous communities or within government policy to help advance and provide empowerment to Indigenous communities as well. So my other background was in language. I used to be a language teacher, and before that was a graphic designer. And so I have a fascination and interest with design things like urban planning, land use, urban design, and then economic development things related to those, as well as the climate crisis and how those all fit together. So.
Hi, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Brittany. So I am actually currently the Senior Policy and Research Analyst at the Broadbent Institute, which is a progressive organization working towards social change here in Canada in the creation of a fair and more just society. A little bit about me, I come to the work of policy through a social justice and community-oriented lens. I spent a good part of my career so far working in the community sector, working with various groups, and I bring that knowledge and that expertise to me or with me into the role I'm in now. At the Institute, I research progressive policies happening in Canada and around the world, but how we can apply it within Canada specifically. So progressive policies on all levels of government, so whether that's the federal government, provincial, and municipal, and also look for opportunities to insert a more equitable and just analysis into some of the work that we're doing. So I'm really excited to have a really robust conversation and a positive conversation, but also a critical one about what's happening currently.
Hey folks, and I'm Ananda. I'm so honored to be on this panel with all of you. Ananda Lee Tan. I'm the son of immigrant parents who moved here in the 60s from Asia. My father's lineage comes from the Hunan Mountains in China. My mother's lineage comes from the Khasi Hills. And I'm from a small intentional community in India called Shantiniketan, which I usually say is the kind of the first experiment at decolonization under the British Empire that started about 120 years ago. But I've been an environmental justice organizer for most of my life. I cut my teeth organizing here in the forests here on the West Coast in the 80s as a labor organizer, organizing my fellow tree planters in the years when I planted trees. And through that organizing pathway, actually entered into some of the first just transition work, which was really big tent coalition work, where unions and environmental groups started supporting a lot of the First Nations sovereignty land and title rights struggles back in the 80s, starting with Delgamuukw, but other really landmark struggles that took place in those years, and really seeing a common future, and really understanding that our aspirations for protecting forests or having community owned enterprise or worker cooperatives was really tied to our ability to, to build on the foundation of First Nations sovereignty, and really supporting the peoples who've been here the longest, and who are really key to really understanding how to both care for the earth and people. And so that was kind of my entry point, and actually also my shift from labor organizing to environmental justice organizing, which for folks who are not familiar, environmental justice organizing is really organizing, serving communities that are on the front lines of ecological crises, from Indigenous communities, Black and Brown communities, poor communities, but communities that are almost always hit first and most by various storms, floods, droughts, fires, but also by the underpinning systemic causes of these of climate change and ecological crises, the industrial systems. I call them the dig, burn, drive, dump industries that cause everything from climate change to this pandemic. So that's what I do. I serve various communities across Turtle Island in their struggles against big corporations.
Thank you for those great introductions, and we're going to get into these topics. So before we do dive in, I just want to let everyone know who's watching, if you have any questions, comments, critiques, ideas for our panelists, or just in general, please send them via the chat, which I believe is through YouTube, or however this technology is working. Speaking of which, if there's any glitches or if there's any odd silences, just bear with us. It's a different way of communicating. Okay, so just to get started, I know we've sort of gotten into a background a bit about yourselves, but how has this crisis directly affected you in the communities that you live in and that you work with? Maybe your friends or families, and what are the things that you as an individual is concerned about? Let's start with Brittany, and then Salem, and then Ananda again, just to give a bit of a taste of what your life is like. I'm sure this comes up in every conversation you have, so it can get a little tiring sometimes, I know, but just a bit of context of what you're seeing through your eyes and how this is impacting you.
No, absolutely. So I am situated right now in the city of Toronto, and as being in a major municipality, we obviously are experiencing this crisis in different ways, in ways that are different in regards to smaller regions or rural regions in Canada. So I've been working from home since, I guess, the start of this pandemic, which the real fear was traveling through public transit. So getting into work through public transportation and knowing that being in a large crowd, not being able to ensure or lower the risk of transmission of the virus. So that was the rationale at the beginning. And this was kind of a little bit before the stay-at-home orders were kind of put into place. And since then, I've been back and forth between my apartment and actually my mother's home. And that has been quite interesting. My mom is, I wouldn't classify her as being elderly, but she's technically a senior on the younger spectrum of things. And, it's been interesting having to grapple or deal with the fears that she has, being somebody who's older and somebody who, as all of us are and were, unsure of how to make sure that we're being safe in this moment in time. So I wanted to be there as a source of support, especially around grocery shopping, especially around getting errands. I thought that was really important and critical. And also as a body of knowledge and education, as being a policy analyst, I do have a little bit more information than the average, which I do try to share as much as I can. I've been sending information through my newsletters. I try to have more more public conversations on Twitter now about what's happening, and really directing and encouraging people to go to the resources that will help them get by during this time. And I'll talk a little bit more about my work in doing that a bit later, but I really wanted to be there as a source of support. Additionally, my mom is also a frontline worker. So she is an ECE who has recently been called back to work. So she's been working for the past, I would say, week now. At the beginning of the pandemic here in Ontario, childcare centers were closed for quite some time. And I know in BC and in Quebec, they had opened up a little bit earlier than Ontario's. So she has actually transitioned back to work. So that has been a process for us in terms of conversations around, what are the safety protocols? Are we both in the know of how do we ensure that you remain safe, but also the children remain safe? Around how is she going to get into work, right? And as somebody who may have opted to take public transportation before, she is now driving. And so there was some of those little changes in adjusting, but overall, I think largely my role during the pandemic, and I'm very grateful that I can occupy this space, is providing support to Canadians who need it, and resources and advocacy.
Thanks. Yeah, my mom is also an ECE teacher, and so I have those concerns about, the children that are there and their families, and then her coming back to us, and it leads to very interesting conversations you'd never think that you'd have with your parents of that sort of nature. Salem?
Yes. This has been very challenging times. As an elected leader for my council, we have about 4,000 citizens in our nation, most of who live in the city of Vancouver, which is extremely unaffordable, and are also Indigenous, and so they carry with us many of the health risks, the socioeconomic health indicators that put us at higher risk. And I've seen some reports from surveys that have gone out in some First Nations communities where they're looking at 40% of their community is at high risk of very severe impacts from COVID. There are, not from my community, but communities that I'm related to, we're starting to see the virus spread and impact people. And we're seeing loss of life in some Indigenous communities now. And there's some really scary possibilities about this. And I think across the country, but I would say less so outside of BC, because BC, I think, is handling it a little bit differently than most of the conservative provinces, where they're trying to reopen the economy as soon as possible. And that suggestion, that idea, puts certain people at less risk than others. You open up too soon, and this spreads through Indigenous communities, and it's going to hit us harder than it'll hit, mostly white communities in Canada. And that's and as we have seen, the government agencies aren't prepared to support us in the ways that we need to support. They never have. They always screw up. So are we supposed to have faith that they're going to get it right this time? That they will actually have the resources in the community, and that they will help us prevent the spread, and that they will provide all of the resources needed to address this? I don't have faith in that. I don't have faith in the medical system. I don't have faith in the political system. I don't have faith in any of it. Because we have to do things on our own, and a lot of First Nations are doing a lot to help prevent the spread of the disease. And in my community, biggest issues are around food insecurity, rent for those who don't live in the community, because there's not a lot of renters in the community, but outside the community, food is a huge issue. And then safety of our elders is a huge issue. So what Brittany's talking about in terms of delivery is a huge service that we're trying to provide to our elders, so that they can limit their exposure outside of the community and things like that. But our communities here in the North Shore, Vancouver, are highly integrated with the other neighboring municipalities. And so we're in the middle of the city almost, right? So it's different for our community than, say, most of the First Nations in Canada, which are more rural. They'll have different experiences than my nation will, but the risk is high for us. And I think that needs to be really emphasized. But I do have to say that Indigenous people are doing their absolute best in this. And I was asked by a reporter a couple of weeks ago on a story that they were doing on Indigenous response to the COVID crisis. And they said, how is your community handling this? And I said, well, I think if I were to venture a guess, I would say Indigenous peoples in Canada probably have a very acute understanding of the risk of a pandemic disease impacting our communities. I think we know a thing or two about what happens when we don't take it seriously. There was 4 waves of diseases that wiped through the northwest coast in my nation from 1781 until 1901, and it wiped out 99.98% of my people. Smallpox, Spanish influenza, measles, smallpox a few times. So we know the risk, and I think our people are taking it seriously. And I think that this discussion is really important about that, because I think when we start thinking about the stimulus that's going to come from this and the impacts as a result of the recessions, I think that it's going to be critical that we include all the communities, not just Indigenous, but all the communities that are going to be more severely impacted by this crisis.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll have a lot to talk about there. And before you just move to Ananda, I was just going to ask you, in terms of the steps the government can take now in terms of building equity and improve the situation as we recover from the crisis, what sort of things does this open the door to in terms of like in the communities that you're seeing and in your community in terms of tangible steps that they can take? Like, we're going to get to it, but like universal basic income, living wage, but things that are more particular to your community and Indigenous communities that they need to see right now on the ground.
The biggest thing that's a challenge is that all of the big decisions around funding and allocations are made, we're still in this patriarchal relationship. So for example, Indigenous Services Canada, which is the federal department responsible for reserves and First Nations band, was given a few $100 million by the federal government by Trudeau's announcement. And then they created this formula where they distributed it to each community's 2016 on-reserve population, so per capita allotment, and then gave an additional amount for communities that were rural, which makes sense because the expenses are a little bit higher in rural areas. And so a community like mine would get around 1.5 million, and a smaller community that has, say, 200 members would get less. Those decisions are made fast and quick, and that's, it's understandable. Government's making decisions daily that in normal circumstances would take weeks or months, going through Treasury Board and things like that, and they're responding really quickly, and they're not going to get it perfect, and I recognize that. But the underlying relationship is still that you have bureaucrats in offices in Ottawa and cabinet ministers in Ottawa making decisions for us. It's not Indigenous people making decisions for ourselves. So that's a huge challenge that needs to fundamentally change throughout this. And then I think similar to a lot of the other, I think the response and what's needed to alleviate the pain and the suffering and the aid that's needed is really about the scale and scope of what's provided. Are the programs that are being implemented enough? Is $2,000 really enough per month for the CRB? Are they developing programs to target who should be prioritized? Should landlords and banks be prioritized in this, or should renters and low-income people be prioritized in this? So I think that there is a challenge with the government taking a skewed bias to how they provide support and where they provide support. So I think that those are the issues that need to be at front of mind and a part of our calls for justice and fairness across the board.
Thank you, Kilson. And we're going to get into a bit more of those specifics and what a bailout looks, what is a bailout? What should it look like if there is a bailout? Who should that support? And also what stimulus packages look like and what we need to do today, tomorrow, and in the future. And just to touch on that as well as, speaking of ground up as opposed to a patriarchal view, you're a grassroots organizer, and what are you seeing in the communities that you work with and that you live in right now in terms of what's going on your eye level?
Well, like Brittany and Salem both said, it's there is a difference. It's very racialized. The different ways in which communities are facing these impacts. And that's what's really always defined environmental justice activism, is our recognition that Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, poor communities are hit impacted much harder. That a lot of what we're witnessing is because the vulnerabilities of those communities are heightened because of the heavy pollution loads that already exist in the communities. The asthma rates, the lung disease rates, the cancer rates, the autoimmune disorders, the diabetes rates in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities are disproportionately higher than white communities because our communities have traditionally carried a disproportionate amount of those pollution loads from those industries, from the oil refineries, the power plants, the incinerators, the toxic waste sites that are located in our backyards. So as such, communities that I serve, like New Orleans, Indigenous communities like the Navajo Nation, Detroit, are being hammered right now because of the rates of, because of the high level of vulnerability that already exists. So what I've been saying is that we need to recognize that this is an environmental justice crisis. This is defined by the parameters of environmental justice, and our response has to be based accordingly. Now, the fortunate thing is our environmental justice movement has history, and like Kelsom was alluding to it, it's not just Indigenous communities, but for years, communities that have had to struggle and survive, they've had to kind of really find out their own ways to do so, where governments, corporations, and settler colonial society hasn't been there to offer solutions. So we have principles, we have protocols, and when you actually look across the landscape, and I support like 80 different communities, different ways and different scales, but when I look across the landscape, those are the first communities to jump into action, to really start thinking about what to do next. One community where we were planning a conference, the Lummi Nation just south of the border, we were planning to have a gathering there of various extractive industry organizers fighting extractive industries. And as soon as their first band member got ill, they shut everything down and they acted as a nation and started building a hospital, a care center. It was the first one that went up way ahead of Trump or any of the state emergency responses. And that's the kind of, how do we lean into support communities where they're already providing leadership is a lot of what we're kind of now wrestling with. And like I say, fortunately, there's a lot of good guidance. We don't have to reinvent the wheel because environmental justice has had a history that has allowed us to identify what principled practice and what decolonized practice looks like, given where we're situated.
Thank you. I do want to turn our minds to that and a positive future that we can look to. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the negatives for a bit, and then look forward to how this crisis ties into the bigger just transition that we're going to talk about. I just wanted to, this pandemic and Canada's response, this response that we're seeing in the US and globally has exposed a lot of these systemic inequalities and the sort of patriarchal colonial system that we live in, and how collectively we have a little safety net and we're kind of living on this very thin margin, a lot of people are. And we're seeing, sort of every sort of sector, every sort of industry collapse. It's not to keep harping on the negative, but how this also exposing the need that we have for employee protections, how strained our healthcare system is, the gap between rich and poor, and how actually the response, this isn't the great equalizer, like people are saying. There's a disproportionately affected poor group of people, and how the economic system that we have doesn't appear to be as resilient as we think it is. And then, as you've touched on, the people who are most vulnerable are also the most vulnerable to a climate crisis. A lot of these communities who are already living on the edge and are under-resourced and undervalued will also be suffering from a climate crisis as well, as that disrupts our livelihood. Brittany, what are a few of these wider social impacts of this public health crisis that have further exposed the inequality that leave people vulnerable to a climate crisis? Could you just give us a few things? I know I touched on like employee issues and healthcare. I just want to get a bit of an idea of like the scope that we're dealing with before we move to sort of talking about how this ties into a climate crisis and how do we bring everything together and move towards a just transition.
Absolutely. So I think one of the things that you just mentioned is that this virus has disproportionate impacts, and that's absolutely true. We know right off the bat that if you did not have a home, a safe and decent home at the beginning of this pandemic, that your risk of either infection or spread or exposure was so much more than those who were able to either self-isolate or go into quarantine or lockdown, etc. So having a really I think critical conversation around housing and the right to housing, I think is really integral in order to, work towards a greener future in this country. So off the bat, populations that were impacted by precarious housing were, of course, those who are homeless or precariously housed. So again, a lot of attention from advocates were being drawn to the homeless population or groups, especially in urban centers, right, that needed that additional support or needed a space to at least self-isolate or quarantine if need be. And then also going back to work, right? A lot of people were laid off at the start of this pandemic or were unable to go to work. As we saw, there's been huge impacts on the economy. And yes, there's been a number of income support programs that have filled the gap, and I'd love to explore that a little bit further, but also not enough attention is being drawn to what happens when an employee severs their ties with their employer. Number one, if you happen to be in a job that included employer benefits, whether that's prescription drug coverage, coverage for mental health services, coverage for a number of other physical health services, you lost that, right? So there are a number of people who rely on these employer drug plans in order to maintain their health that have now been compromised. So I think revisiting the conversation around universal access to prescription drug coverage, mental health care, vision care, et cetera, I think that's really integral. Another group that is now starting to get some attention are social assistance recipients. Some of the most vulnerable groups in society, economically vulnerable and marginalized in society. How do government programs or have government programs stepped up? The CERB and a lot of the other federal programs focus largely on workers, social assistance recipients. Some do work, some are not included in the labor market, right? So how are they getting by, right? And that there hasn't been a lot of attention towards that. We did see in BC, who I feel has been leading the way in regards to income supports. They increased social assistance rates for those who weren't receiving federal support, but also allowed social assistance recipients to keep their federal benefits, which I think is really key. Lifting people out of poverty is, I think, one of the first and foremost steps in terms of working towards a greener society and working towards combating against climate change. And we also saw with BC issuing a climate tax credit, recognizing that additional financial supports are going to need to go to those who are economically disenfranchised in order to steer our society down a direction where we can have a greener society, a greener economy, et cetera. And the last thing I wanted to touch on are diverse groups that my fellow panelists already talked about, and the fact that our data collection in this country is extremely spotty right now. We are not, Toronto actually just announced that they'll be collecting race-based data, but there hasn't been any provincial announcements that will be collecting data. This is data that would also include Indigenous folks. It's really important for the rest of the country, I think, to really understand how pandemics impact Indigenous peoples due to, one, their already pre-existing conditions and the fact that the federal government has been dutifully neglecting Indigenous peoples in this country, but also how racialized folks are disproportionately or could be disproportionately exposed or at risk to this virus. We don't have that information. We're already really bad at collecting data in Canada, but I think at a pandemic, data is even more important. And being here in Ontario, data collection is not easy, or data in this pandemic is not easy to come by. So those are some of the existing inequities. And I think tying this back to work, we don't know what jobs are going to come back after this pandemic, right? And there has been a lot of talk in regards to a greener, a just transition or a greener economy around jobs or workers that will need to be transitioned to the economy of the future. And I think it does present an opportunity to have that conversation around what a new world of work could look like in Canada, but also recognizing that a lot of these workers were suddenly thrust into loss of work rather than easily transitioned out in a just way. So I think that's really important for us to recognize in terms of the vulnerabilities here when it comes to addressing our climate crisis.
Thank you, Brittany. And you touch on something that we want to get to about workers in a transition and what jobs will look like after. I just want to back up a little bit. And I know that we're getting into the idea of a green recovery and a just transition. So I want to go back and discuss that a little bit and sort of define it. Not to hit the nail harder, but not only are we dealing with this crisis, but we're dealing with a climate emergency and a climate crisis as well. Greenpeace and other groups are calling on our government to make sure any money that we're spending now on bailouts or stimulus that help with the recession now are also helping us build resilience towards any impending environmental crises. And the federal government is working on a big economic recovery package, and it's supposed to be ready in June. And we'd like to see how we can provide for a green future through that. Ananda, why is it important for the economic recovery to build environmental resilience? And what does it mean to have a justice-centered recovery?
Well, that's a really good question. And I'll try to frame it from a story, perhaps. Like I had the privilege, I'm actually also ex-Greenpeace. I worked with Greenpeace over 20 years ago now, but a couple of years ago, after a major hurricane hit Puerto Rico, we had the opportunity to collaborate with Greenpeace US. One of their Greenpeace boats was coming to the US, and Annie Leonard kindly provided use of the boat, and we were able to get a lot of aid and skilled workers and a lot of people who were able to take over to Puerto Rico some critical supplies. And in that, as an environmental justice formation, one of the formations I didn't mention that I serve is the Climate Justice Alliance, which is it's a sort of a Turtle Island wide network of Indigenous Black and Brown communities on the front lines of climate change, both fighting the industries causing climate change, but also trying to figure out ways where FEMA doesn't show up. How do young people in communities actually organize to respond to storms, forest fires, droughts headed our way? And I think key to that is to be justice-centered is really to follow local leadership. Really, there's I've shared some resources. There's EJ principles at the first People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in 1991. Folks came up with, and these are principles that weren't created by an intelligentsia or a set of experts. These were principles that were vetted by thousands of Indigenous Black and Brown communities back in the day, that were run by communities, and people contributed to them and were developed collaboratively across a large landscape and brought to a national summit and ratified with representatives of all these communities, key organizers of their time. And so these are principles that really embody the shared values of our cultures. And I think one of the things that, and I'll highlight this, is one of the principles, for example, that needs to guide our work is, and that exists across not just Indigenous cultures, but a lot of the racialized cultures, especially migrant communities that have come here, from all over the world, is looking after the needs of those most vulnerable first. And ironically, before I went into self-isolation, the two meetings I helped facilitate, one was a meeting of hunters of some interior Salish people with the Secropmic communities up in Chase, and listening and learning from hunters and gatherers in that community, sharing the knowledge. One thing I came away with learning is that how that deeply embodied principle of making sure that there was enough meat through the winter for the elders, for the single mothers, the people who needed that protein most, was the people's primarily obligation that everyone stated. And after that meeting, I went to the city of Detroit, where hundreds of thousands of people, over 100,000 people, were shut off from their water. There was a big struggle to get the water back, to taps turned back on. And listening to the elders talk about the needs of the young people really stepping up to serve those most needed, it really brought back home that core environmental justice principle is something that can be used to guide dominant culture institutions, to guide the settler colonial agencies that we deal with, in saying, this is how we do it in our community. This is how you, government agencies, whether the federal, local, state governments, provincial governments, need to follow community leadership at all levels of decision making that are in line with principles of self-determination, principles of caring for those most in need, and principles of local knowledge and leadership. those are just few. There's 17 principles, and I won't go into any detail, but we don't have to create them anew because our ancestors did that for us.
And we'll try to post some of these later so people can have an idea and read through them themselves. For me, I guess that's what sort of resonates from what you said is sort of sharing is caring. Spread the wealth and spread the knowledge, and show that compassion for one another. Salem, what can the environmental proposals that are proposed through a just recovery be part of? How can they be part of a wider justice and decolonization agenda?
That's, it's a big question, and I'll try and say
it
that.
is.
So here's the part of that's really important about, I think, the tying the recovery to the phases of the recovery. There's the recovery phase, which is kind of the immediate aftershock of the crisis. And then there will be the long-term kind of stimulus kind of injections that happen over the long term, over a year from now, for example. And then it'll also take time for those things to be implemented. If the government was to pour $90 billion into low-income housing across the country, which would be unprecedented. They've only committed $20 billion so far over the last 5 years. That would take a while for that money to actually impact the economy in terms of jobs and injection into the economy and stuff. So on the climate side, though, the projects that actually really need to be included, and I think that can achieve a lot, is around jurisdiction for First Nations to have control over energy projects. There's a lot of renewable energy projects and control of our own utilities. Right now, like in BC, the utilities are controlled by the Crown. So First Nations being allowed to set up their own utilities and control their own energy production, whether it's from run-of-the-river projects, which some First Nations own, or whether it's from solar or wind, things like that. The other part is there is a huge need for retrofits. Energy use and energy efficiency on older buildings is a huge part of the emissions problem. So there's a huge need to invest in the retrofits and then put new standards in for new buildings. And then transportation. Transportation accounts for 35% of our emissions in the country. And our federal government does not contribute enough to supporting the expansion and development of affordable, accessible transit, and reducing the need for cars and transportation. But I will say one thing that I think the climate movement is missing right now and needs to be emphasized is that there is a belief among some technocrats within the climate policy world that the solution to addressing that 35% of transportation can be solved with more electric vehicles. But we know that that's a problem in terms of the mining aspects and the other downriver aspects of expanding electric vehicles. We actually need to reduce the number of cars we have to use as a society. And so when we think about transit funding, which is addressing 35% of our emissions in transportation, that's because people are driving from the suburbs to the city and back and forth and all that kind of stuff. And so real strong climate policy also includes a zoning reform and changing the way that we plan and design our communities. We need to get away from the urban sprawl, building upside. In BC, we have mountains, so up the mountains, expanding out, and we need to start thinking about this idea of complete communities, which is a policy idea, one of the big ideas from the city of Vancouver, that is an idea to build communities, design urban plan communities, where you could access all of your needs within a 5-minute walk. So school, food, entertainment, work, living, everything, 5-minute walk, and then connect all of those communities through transit. So you reduce the need for cars. And I'll just give a little plug for those that are interested. My nation is proposing to build 6,000 units of housing in Vancouver on a 10-acre site, 70 to 90% of it being rental. And we are proposing a maximum of 10% parking on the site, which is actually not allowed under city policy. And because we're building on reserve lands, my council gets to set the policy, not the city of Vancouver. And so we're doing 10% parking stalls on 6,000 units, because we're imagining the future of development, which is not going to be in cars. It's going to be in alternative modes of transportation, like walking and biking and transit. And those are the big ideas that we need to advance. And I think that the climate movement doesn't quite yet articulate that, and when we fight for the policies we want. And I think that's a huge part of it. And then there's other stuff too, in terms of leakages on some of the industrial stuff, and decarbonization of some of our industries that need to happen over the next 10 years and things like that. But in terms of projects to support that need to be included as stimulus, there's a lot around, I think, what I would call like wood and nail projects, construction projects that are easy to fund. And also, I think I'll add just quickly, I'm speaking along here, is that we are seeing unprecedented low interest rates for governments to borrow against. Now is the absolute perfect time to borrow for large scale investment in infrastructure, especially climate infrastructure, and use the low interest rates that they have right now to make those investments. It's practically like you're going to make money off of borrowing at this point. So the investment is going to come back tenfold, and this is, I think, some of the places that the federal government especially can do some heavy lifting.
Interesting. And I think Brittany had a comment on that when you were talking about urban planning and not focusing on electric cars, but kind of redesigning our cities. Brittany?
Yeah, I'm so glad that Salem touched on transit, because they absolutely need a massive bailout. In Toronto right now, the TTC is losing millions of dollars, and they're at risk of laying off workers, but also due to reduced service because there are stay-at-home orders, they're trying to recoup costs. Now, the city of Toronto is in a peculiar circumstance, because a lot of the money that goes into funding transit is done through fares, which is not an equitable or sustainable way to ensure transit service. So because fares have been dramatically reduced, a lot of TTC funding has also been removed from the TTC as well. So public transit absolutely needs an infusion of money. And I think why that's really important to bring up is because we want to think about, what does reintegration look like? What does reopening back up the economy look like? People are likely going to be scared, possibly, to be in large groups, or maybe even in crowds, or maybe even in public places with people that they may not know, right? And that is exactly what public transit is. It's really hard to ensure, good social distancing measures when you're on a crowded bus, for example, right? So if we're going to really start to encourage people to go back, reopen society, kind of go back and start doing things a little bit normally again, we really want to encourage people to do that on transit and not stay in their cars. And by doing that, transit needs to be up and running. It needs to be operational. It needs to have the resources to maintain service while also encouraging social distancing measures, which means that less people have to be on buses and trains in order to maintain service. So I think that's really important to think through. How are we going to encourage people to start moving around the city again? Of course, there's been lots of conversations around widening streets and sidewalks, etc. But then that also brings in the conversation around our homeless population, or those who do happen to live on streets. How are we ensuring that they are in a safe place? How do we ensure that people remain housed in general? Renters are particularly at risk right now during the pandemic. There has been a ban on rent evictions across the country. A couple of provinces have noted that they banned rent increases, but there's no real plan for renters after this pandemic is over. And what about those renters who may be in arrears due to lack of payments or not being able to make those payments, right? We may risk a lot of people losing their homes, which could be a further public health crisis, economic crisis down the road. So I think that's really extremely important. And I think another thing that the environmental movement needs to think through is possible disposal of masks and PPEs. So we don't really know what the orders around wearing masks will be moving towards the future. Right now, people are encouraged to wear masks in public spaces, primarily the grocery store, etc. What will it look like? Will people need to continue wearing masks in public spaces? How are we disposing of this? How are we ensuring that we're not going to have another crisis on our hands similar to plastics, or we just have plastics piling up? So I think thinking through proper disposal, but also education around PPEs, education around mask wearing of residents, I think that's really important, and I think that's crucial. And Nope, I think that's it for me for now, but yes.
Thanks, Brittany. You sort of touched on, kind of the theme of this, and I wanted to direct this question to Ananda to sort of reorient us, but I don't want this to get lost, but why is it important that the current economic crisis address environmental issues? As Brittany was saying, all of these things that are happening now could have this ripple effect environmentally and further economic collapses or other economic issues. I just want to focus in on, why do we even need to address environmental issues, and what do they have to do with the economy?
Good question. And I think this goes back to a point that Kausalam raised, is that the biggest challenge that national and international environmental organizations and the climate movement have had is really adopting a systems thinking analysis, a systems analysis of understanding the problems, which the environmental justice movement, because of our association with the land, because of our cultures, because of our positionality to these crises, has had to take a much more intersectional approach, has always seen these environmental crises as fundamentally economic crises and never really separated the two, has always seen race, poverty, and environment as being linked at the hip. So essentially, when I said this was an environmental justice pandemic, for the environmental justice movement, we understand that the underpinnings are economic underpinnings. The root causes of this environmental crises, of this public health crisis, which are one and the same, are the economic drivers of greed, of hoarding, of wealth concentration, of corporate control, and of really rape of the earth and culture and lives. And so one way to think about how do we shift and pivot towards an economic system that then is aligned with public health needs, the needs of communities to clean air, clean water, healthy food, adequate shelter, space for culture to thrive, is to actually think about how do we create economies that serve community need and not corporate greed, and really make that shift. And this goes to the design part. This is the really interesting part about it, because as you then start using these principles to really shape your analyses of the problem and where the solutions lie, you come to the kind of thinking that Kausalam was also referring to. Actually, both my fellow panelists were referring to, that are community-based solutions, community-rooted solutions that are really look at systems change from the perspective of moving away from the globalized economy to how do we relocalize, because in relocalizing economies is the biggest cut in greenhouse gas emissions that we can actually manage. And I because I helped Greenpeace develop its early climate campaign back in the day, I know some of the challenges we were faced with when we used a reductionist approach by looking at the oil and gas sector, the transportation sector, and all these sectors as separate sectors. And when I came back to the EJ movement, I realized that thinking was all wrong. That when we think about restructuring our economies to meet need and move away from the artificial determinants of development and greed and hoarding and profit margins and the Wall Street benchmarks that budgets are based on, we're actually brought to a whole different scale of thinking around what do we really need. And this crisis, if anything, has shown us that what we really need and what we need to be providing the most vulnerable in our communities, the poor, the sick, the elderly, the disenfranchised, the criminalized, the homeless. When we meet the needs of those most vulnerable in society, we will be able to define the sustainable economy that then meets all our needs. We'll be able to not only build the public transportation systems we need, the houses we need, we look at the basic, what do we need to survive? Food, shelter, clothing, transportation, housing. When we look at that, we realize that a lot of the infrastructure that they want to build, these pipelines and these mega projects out there, are unnecessary. The only reason those infrastructure projects are going forward is to fuel, to basically increase the size of the coffers, the corporate coffers on Wall Street. They don't actually meet community need. So it's how do we reorient our thinking towards being able to push and really challenge the direction, because there's going to be a lot of missed opportunities when we're fighting governments that are providing $1 trillion bailouts to the oil and gas sector and keeping these man camps, that are building these infrastructure projects going as essential projects where they're not essential. It should be the communities that decide what's essential and how our monies are spent. And that's where we can pivot into what is the the deep systemic change needed for economy that works for all.
Thank you. And before we turn to that and turn to the big buzzword we've all been hearing about, the Green New Deal, we have a couple of more comments on this topic from Salem and then Brittany. And then we're going to move to these. How do we take these big concepts and all these intersectional issues, and what do people actually propose to do to shift our system? So I'll turn it over to Salem and then Brittany to just round off this topic before we move on to that.
So yeah, quickly, I just Ananda made a comment that I'm like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. So another plug that I'll give is when we're talking about stimulus and we're also talking about systems change and we're talking about this whole world, something important is that governments are going to provide stimulus that is government-based and 100% publicly funded projects. And they're also going to provide a lot of programs that are geared towards the private sector. And there's like carrots and sticks kind of thing, you know, incentives, financing, etc., investment, green projects and things like that. The area that I think that is really underdeveloped in Canada is actually the cooperative model among businesses. And that when we think about economic development, we often think about, you know, corporate structures and businesses, or even this thing of small businesses. But the cooperative model is a really powerful tool to help reduce that inequality and have all of the capital wealth generated off your business owned and controlled by the workers of that business, especially, or the producers. Remember, cooperatives are a little bit different, but specifically worker cooperatives and producer cooperatives. And as an example, I would really recommend people look at the impact that the cooperative movement had in a couple of places in Europe. The Emilia-Romagna region of Italy, for example, during the 2009 crisis, had a significant less impact of layoffs and wage reductions among the cooperative owned businesses than the corporate businesses, because the members and the owners of the businesses were the same. And so when they had to make tough decisions about laying off people or reducing hours or providing services to their members, they were saying, no, the owners of this business are also the workers of this business, and we're going to take care of each other as best as we can, as opposed to shareholders or corporate profits and things like that. So I think the cooperative movement, it has to be a big part of the conversation.
Thanks. And Brittany?
Yeah, I also think right now we're seeing the importance of green space and how much people are valuing that right now during this crisis. And I think there's an opportunity to insert that narrative and perspective when it comes to climate organizing. Where do we gather in spaces? How have those spaces provided you know, a sense of community, but also a sense of safety, but also a sense of reconnecting back with either ourselves, the earth, or etc. And I think more than ever, we need to preserve, but also acknowledge and recognize the green spaces that exist and how and the role that they've played during this pandemic. I love Salem's idea around, you know, complete communities and that reducing our carbon footprint. I think that's really, really important. And then I know you're about to segue into the Green New Deal, but because we are in a pivotal time of restructuring and having a lot of question marks around what type of economy are we going to be entering into after this pandemic, I think right now it's a critical time to start thinking about the type of jobs that people, you know, are going to need, but also the type of jobs that we will absolutely need moving us into the future where we need to think about sustainability.
If I could build on that, just one short thing, because I think this is a brilliant and important thread about green space. I want to actually acknowledge a really wonderful Council of Matriarchs, Coast Salish and Interior Salish Matriarchs have recently started supporting the Working Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty. And they've got an Indigenous Food and Freedom School that's working closely with Parks Board to rethink what would it look like to restore Indigenous food lands in an urban setting where there are parks, where we do have the privilege of parks, but there's an opportunity where big cement constructions and highways do not serve our long-term needs to bring back the salmon into communities, to bring back fish streams and places where Indigenous foods can be harvested even in suburban and urban areas. And this is I think there's a huge opportunity. What I've been learning is really some of the deeply rooted principled thinking around that design. And I believe it will provide models for food, another critical need for communities around the world. If we shift to understanding that we don't need to be growing lawns, we should be growing food in every neighborhood to relocalize our food systems. And those shifts, how that can take us in the direction of both the environmental sustainability we need, but also the economical models that'll support us. Check.
Thank you so much. And speaking of that and growing food, my seedlings are finally sprouting. It's an exciting time to look at them every day, move them to the sun and water them. So we've been talking about a lot of these big ideas, and sometimes it can be overwhelming to think about, okay, co-ops, we need cooperatives, we need transitioning jobs, we need better urban planning, we need green spaces, food security. It's very exciting, but it's also all encompassing. And there have been some ideas put forward. How do we totally rethink our system? And one of those forms has been through the idea of this Green New Deal, which is based off of the New Deal in the United States several decades ago. So various Green New Deal proposals have been put forward in Canada, in the US, and around the world. And it's being pushed by frontline communities, environmental activists, scientists, and politicians. And it's become a real buzzword or an idea recently. At its heart, the Green New Deal is a term that encapsulates thinking on how we tackle climate breakdown and make our society fairer. So basically encompassing all of these ideas. So I just want to sort of put an umbrella around some of these concepts and ideas. And just throwing it back to you, Ananda, you've been a co-author of one of the Green New Deal proposals. And a year has passed since the Canadian coalition put forward its own version, the Pact for a Green New Deal. What have been the main results and learnings from these proposals?
No, thanks for bringing this up. This is actually kind of one of those very complex fields, and I'll just name that up front, because one of the things when the Green New Deal in the US really came up and is brought up by this youth mobilization called Sunrise, in conjunction with some of the progressives that had been elected in the last Bernie Sanders mobilization, some really wonderful young women of color leaders from communities like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Ayo Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But what was a bit challenging was the actual framework that was first proposed was actually proposed by big NGOs and funders. And when the frontline communities I serve first looked at the Green New Deal, we realized that there were some really problematic racialized flaws that were reminiscent of the original New Deal, which a lot of people don't know, but the New Deal that was introduced during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's time was highly racialized, only served working class white communities, introduced the concept of redlining, and in some communities like the cities of Detroit, completely cut out African American and other communities of color from receiving any of the benefits of the infrastructure and stimulus packages of the times. And that's something that we were really afraid of. And so when we looked at the first language that was being proposed, we noticed that there were some problems. One, you should all, I try to share this with all the climate activists, beware of the term net zero. Because when we first sat down with AOC and some of these young activists who are putting forward this proposal, they didn't know what the term meant. But net zero emissions basically is a loaded term that really comes out of a neoliberal corporate climate policy agenda that means carbon trading and corporate-led solutions. That corporations will be allowed to find whatever means necessary to reduce their emissions in lieu of not actually reducing their emissions, by actually offsetting them, planting trees, creating bogus technology projects out there, or even engaging in a carbon market that we've seen disproportionately burdens and actually creates environmental hotspots for communities of color. So just wanted to note that. So that's the first. We actually entered the Green New Deal with a combative stance to kind of purge it of all the what we saw as false solutions. And in doing so, we introduced language like around just transition, language that sort of embodied the concept of reparations, to acknowledge that there is not only disproportionate burdens and benefits in economic investments that are very racialized, that there's historic burdens that need to be addressed first. And there's historic harm, starting with stolen lands from indigenous communities, starting with the harm, the multi-century harm associated with the transatlantic slave trade, the ongoing harm from the ongoing racialized violence from all these streams of oppression that continue to disenfranchise communities of color across Turtle Island. So the dialogue shifted, but it actually allowed us to take actually a much more intersectional approach. When the labor unions got involved, we actually started looking at, well, where Green New Deal planning, it should be seen as a planning framework. When that planning framework is applied, how is it done in a deeply democratic manner where communities and workers and the communities where those workers are from get to participate at all levels of decision making in the direction of the Green New Deal. So for example, in Detroit, the city of Detroit, there's now a coalition that started as part of this Green New Deal wave that is now rooted in the poorest African-American communities in Detroit, sitting at the table saying, this is what a new water, a new food, a new public transportation, a new education, a new healthcare system should look like. And that was just starting to happen through people's movement assemblies just before the pandemic hit. But it's I think the opportunity of the Green New Deal, really, to me, it represents how do we envision a new society from a deeply democratic base that totally flips the script of planning and decision making and puts all the power in the hands of the communities on the front lines.
Thanks. Salem, just to follow up on that, what is your experience with the Green New Deal and that idea? And sort of a cynical question I have is, you know, it all sounds great in theory, and the idea of it sounds wonderful, but how do we push up against these existing forces against an idea of a Green New Deal that you've already pointed out to us, such as, you know, like the colonial system we have, the patriarchal system we have, the capitalist system that we have? How do we take an idea like a Green New Deal, and how can we actually push against these forces that are pushing down on us? You're on mute.
I'm going to unmute myself first to answer the question. I actually really love talking about the Green New Deal, but I'm going to come at it from a particular area of focus. So I'm going to say that the details of what should go in it are actually the easiest part of the conversation, because if the idea that the Green New Deal, at least from the States, if you were to take it at its kind of simplest objectives, it's taking this idea that we need to first meet the targets set out by the IPCC report to reduce our emissions to prevent anything more than a 1.5 increase in emissions by 2030. So that's the main kind of, it's like there's a tangible targeted goal, and it's by basically half. We have to cut it in half, 40 to 60%. We have to cut our emissions in half in 10 years, less than 10 years now. So that's like one goal. And then the secondary goal, which is tied to it, is that it has, whatever we do to accomplish that first thing, has to address the inequality that exists within our society, both wealth and income, and talks about racial inequity and frontline communities and things like that. So it's whatever we need to do to meet the target of 2030, and all the things that are within that sphere that would also address the wealth and income issues and the inequity issue. The climate part is actually quite knowable, because we know from a lot of the data that's available, we know what industry, what sectors of our country are causing the emissions. We know theoretically how much emissions are being caused across the country and by province. And we know what policies are needed in order to actually bring those emissions down. Like, a lot of that stuff is known. The problem is what does the political body want to prioritize, and what does the electorate who chooses them want to prioritize in that, and what level of cost are Canadians and taxpayers willing to take on to achieve those goals. So that's all part of the knowable stuff, I would say. My analysis or my critique of the Green New Deal conversation in Canada is this. I think that there is a fundamental misunderstanding by political activists in Canada around the role that resource economies play, not just in the economy of Canadian lives, but in the culture of Canadian lives. That in the States, the connection between organized labor and climate activism is a lot different because of, I would say, the amount of organized labor that is not based in resource extraction. You can have whole cities and towns who are full of organized union members, and so the concept of organized labor there is different than Canada. It exists in Canada, and public sector is a huge part of the labor organized labor force in Canada. But there is a psychological understanding, and I think a connection of a lot of Canadians to the resource economy. You may not have grown up in it, but maybe your parents did, or maybe your grandparents did. And so when we're talking about this Green New Deal idea in Canada, there are certain policies that I think run into what many Canadians might consider reasonable and feel like, oh, actually, I don't understand that, and cause some anxiety and fear. And I think that connection of Canada being a resource economy is built into the culture of Canada. It's similar to, as another example, when we talk about right to housing and providing more low-income housing, I think a lot of activists often forget that for a lot of Canadians, the idea of home ownership is really high, like even among progressives. And there's also all kinds of reasons why home ownership is a issue, or is something that, for example, a lot of immigrant communities or new arrivals to Canada really care about in terms of bringing their relatives from other countries here too as well, because you can't do that if you live in public housing. So I think the problem that I see is that the conversation around Green New Deal is trying to replicate the same circumstances that exist in the States and bring it here. And we're dealing with some different circumstances there. That's one piece of it. The other part is, if you look at what happened in the United States and why the Green New Deal conversation was able to blow up, it really speaks to the governance structure of the US versus the governance structure of Canada. When you have a federal government, you have one election, and the legislative branch of government and the executive branch of government are the same people. And then you have a Senate, which has some influence, but it's not like the Senate in the States. And so you can have somebody like AOC who introduces a Green New Deal bill into the House in the US and work with a senator and put this as a part of the conversation, and then have a presidential election which is separate and have candidates run on pose and benchmark against it. Here, it's not the same structure to get those policy ideas up to the federal level. And the last thing that I'll say about this is that my observation that I think we need to understand as a movement is that most of the large-scale societal policy changes that have happened in Canada have not come from a federal and then down level. When we look at a lot of the changes around equity for LGBTQ folks, for trans folks in terms of human rights legislative changes, healthcare within Canada, Indigenous rights and voting. There's a whole bunch of areas where it all started provincially and then went to the federal government. And I think that we need to understand that. And the real challenge we have as a movement, that if you look at the Confederation, they're all conservative except for BC. And we're organizing in a place where we have mostly conservative governments. And that presents an opportunity because when conservative governments are in power, that's when progressives are able to develop the policy ideas that the centrists and the neoliberals and the liberals try to adopt and steal in order to gain a broad enough coalition to take power away from the conservatives. And that's what happened with the federal liberals. And look at what the policies that we fought for during the 10 years of Harper. Those were adopted, and now they're being implemented. It's hard to win new progressive policy debates when you have a quasi-progressive government in power, or non-conservative, I should say. And I think that we need to focus on going after local policy changes on climate and Green New Deal stuff at the local level, and really drive home that our organizing needs to focus on those next provincial elections and get those Liberal and NDP parties to take really aggressive stances when they go into those elections. And then we are able to see the changes, and it'll happen at a provincial level, and eventually the federal government will follow suit.
Thanks, Salem. Brittany, I know this is your jam too. I think that's very succinct, and it leads into my question for Brittany is, what lessons do you see from the past on how our movement can best pressure government to make that transformative change? And I know this is your area of expertise, so I'd love to hear your opinion on how we get the ground up in terms of the implementation of the ideas of these Green New Deal.
I was just going to say that was excellent. Salem, sorry, I hope I'm saying that correctly. That was just so profound, and I agree completely with everything that you just mentioned. I think what's really important is that whenever there is some sort of mass change or shift in society, it accompanies confusion. People get left behind. Those who have the means are able to get by. Those who don't may fall through the cracks or even may be chastised because of it. And when I say mass change, I'm referring to moments of crises. So for example, during this pandemic, it is very clear that those who had more access to information, resources, a home, etc., were much better off than those who didn't, right? So I think what's really important is that we have to ensure that we're not leaving anybody behind and that we're putting people first before any sort of green change or any sort of conversations around the economy. It has to be centered around people, and having it centered around people, that is when you start looking to local communities and their solutions. So I want to take it actually one step further to call Salem's comment around provinces or provincial governments being the main driver. I'm going to say even local governments or local solutions actually can put that pressure on provincial governments. And then, there's a direct relationship between the federal government and municipalities increasingly as you move forward with cities having more prominence within Canada. So local driven solutions is really important and key. And also these solutions have to be accompanied with community supports. Education has to be a part of any transition towards a Green New Deal. Frontline support to those who are accessing services, those who require information. With any sort of societal governance change, there are going to be people who don't know how to navigate this new system, don't know where to go for resources, don't know what they should be doing, what they shouldn't be doing. So you need to make sure that community supports are there in place with the introductions of new policies, ideas, etc. And then lastly that I want to say is that going towards a greener society at times can be inherently classist, right? So those who have the resources to do so are often able to do so, and those who don't are not going to be able to have the same access or not being able to strive towards getting towards the green goals that we all want to aspire for. So I think providing people with adequate income is really important in any Green New Deal. And that includes access to good and decent work. That includes raising wages, minimum wages to begin with. That includes ensuring that those who are on social assistance, those who are on a number of different government programs, those programs actually have adequate income levels of support. I think that's really key. And then also with this just transition, just to end this off, I think it's recognizing, I think Salem made a great point around the connection between the resource sector and Canadians in society, and even the connection around home ownership, which is a whole other ballgame. But a just transition plan needs to be centered, but also because there's been a sudden job loss. There hasn't been a transition in place. There actually may be people who worked in manufacturing sectors, who worked in the oil patches, who will not go back to their job at all. So I think a recognition of that loss, in addition to income supports that tie folks over as we move towards a just transition, I think it's really key. And then also jobs that have varying levels of ability. This is just not going to be an economy of folks who can participate in the knowledge economy, or folks who can participate in sectors that require various levels of ability. Obviously, there's going to be construction jobs, there's going to be different sorts of manufacturing jobs, but I think it's really important to have a diverse labor market that encourages labor participation from all groups of people, regardless of their abilities. So I think that's really key moving forward. But I think at the end of the day, it needs to center people, and it needs to be grounded in local communities and local community solutions as well.
Thanks, Brittany. I do want to move next to talking about the resource sector, but there's a question that came up about what is exactly a complete community. So if are you able to define what a complete community is? And I guess we can talk about it a bit after, but the idea of a Green New Deal on the local level, are there, speaking from your experience, what are the local things that people can sort of do in terms of creating that complete community and envisioning the idea of a Green New Deal on a smaller scale?
So I'm actually going to pass the concept of a complete community to Salem.
Sure.
I think he has a bit more expertise and knowledge in that area, but I do want to recognize that not every community in Canada needs to be the same. We are a vast country with regional differences, some urban, some suburban, some rural. Some suburban communities, actually the way they've been built, cannot be built into urban communities, and some rural communities cannot be then built into urban communities. So I think there's some recognition there of the region in which we're operating in and how to best support that region to ensure that people have low carbon emissions, people are not forced to drive everywhere, that people can access services and supports without having to get into their car or go long distances to do so. So I think a lot of it is about increasing access and supports within the existing infrastructure, but also figuring out how can we maximize these communities. There's an interesting thing that happened here in Ontario, in Brampton, which is a suburb that's increasingly being urbanized, but there's so much residential homes that are built in that suburb that it will never get to the levels of, let's say, Toronto, just because there's a lot of homeowners there. Or homes or large scale homes there. But Brampton actually reduced one of their lanes because a lot of people aren't driving right now, rightfully so, because we should be staying home as much as we can. And they expanded their sidewalks, right? So I think there's a little bit of an experiment there to play with. What are some roads that maybe don't get as much traffic use, right? And how could we start experimenting with different ways that we can encourage people to start walking more. But in the case of Toronto, I think what's first and foremost in terms of a complete community, we have suburbs in the city of Toronto that are cut off from good transportation, that are food deserts, that do not have grocery stores within proximity. We have suburbs in Toronto that are, it's unsafe to bike in because there are no bike lanes and because they're car-driven roads. So I think within the city of Toronto and urban cities within themselves is looking at what are the inequities that exist within this city in terms of getting people to adopt a greener lifestyle. And I think in suburban parts of Toronto, it is very difficult, especially in the Northwest and the eastern parts of the city to get around without a vehicle. It's very challenging. And if you are taking transit, you're commuting upwards to 2 hours a day. Again, that is an income issue, that is a decent work issue, and that is also a public transportation issue too. So again, it's how do we ensure that we have the supports around people in order to enable them to live, to maximize their livelihoods, but also to transition towards greener lifestyles as well.
Thanks, Brittany. Kasam, do you want to just give that definition of what a complete community is?
So complete community is a policy idea that's emerging in a lot of different urban and suburban planning. And it's specifically speaking to the fact that if you can build communities where people don't need to rely on an automobile for their primary transportation, and you can build work and school and food and play and entertainment and your home closer together, you can actually reduce the need for a car, which reduces the emission of transportation because you can now walk and bike close to, and that the idea is that you can basically get all of your core needs within a 5-minute distance walk of your home. And there's like examples, and that's not just like tall skyscrapers with malls on the bottom, because there's neighborhoods where they've done lots of urban development with these large tall skyscrapers, and there's no commercial activity below, there's no office space, it's just residential, and you like go up into your apartment and you come down in your car and you drive into the city, drive to your work somewhere else and all that kind of stuff. So the big thing is that it helps reduce the emissions as going on a go forward basis, because you're able to change the structure of how a city moves around. And we can see, and in some cities in North America, increased transit ridership, increased bike transportation, walking, things like that, depending on what the city is having a huge effect on reducing carbon emissions and reducing the need for things that produce carbon. Vehicles will likely go electric at some point for the most part. but even then, you still are dealing with transportation of goods in terms of carbon emissions, and then also the other impacts of electric vehicles and the cost they have on the environment and energy. You know, if BC, for example, if you were to put everybody into an electric vehicle, the amount of dams and other forms of energy that you would need to produce in order to meet that demand is massive. And so electric vehicles aren't going to be the solution.
Thanks, Salem. I just want to end this area off by just, Brittany, remind me that each community is different, and solutions for those communities, there are certain basic tenets that we have to remember, but each solution will be community driven and unique to that. And that's what will make it interesting and organic, and it's something to look forward to. I was
just going to say, but also more practical, right? We want
Yes.
our ideas to be implemented well. Implementation is an integral part of any grand policy idea. And if you're not thinking through implementation and the ways that people are going to adopt it, then it's going to be hard to actually see those ideas come to fruition.
Exactly. I'm going to pivot a little bit to what Salem had brought up with regards to the resource industry. The federal government has already started stimulus spending, and a week ago they launched a multi-billion-dollar emergency package to put oil industry employees to clean up abandoned oil wells and help companies reduce their methane emissions. Ideally, the oil and gas industry would pay to clean up their own mess, but the companies have abandoned the wells and have already gone bankrupt, and there's some environmental justice and health issues here concerning adjacent communities. So we also know that the oil and gas industry have been lobbying pretty hard, the government, in the past month or so. What was your reaction to this news about the lobbying and the bailout? And what do you think is the future for the oil industry in Canada from your perspective? So let's start with Salem and then move to Ananda and Brittany.
I'll try to be very succinct. This is a hard one to summarize.
It is a hard one. It's sort of, if you can think of, the aura that you're getting, it's a crystal ball sort of thing.
I'll speak fast so I can I really want my other panelists.
Take your time.
Okay, so I'm going to be honest and say that the Trudeau's announcement about the funding for the oil well recovery stuff is actually, it's not perfect. Let's be honest about that. The idea of the public stepping in to clean up the mess by the corporate sector is not ideal. Absolutely. But there is a structural problem that we're fighting, which is that you have decades of corporate interests controlling and influencing how policy and regulations are created, and it's all structured to support capital. The way the shell companies and allowing the shell companies to absolve them of any liabilities, like they've structured this. They did that for that reason. They have teams of lawyers who are advising them on how to mitigate the risk when they built those wells, and that's why that the system's designed that way. It was completely legal. And so we have a structural problem where government over successive years is just built and designed by their lobbyists and by their interests. So it's bad and it's awful and it sucks. I would say the silver lining for me is the fact that the Trudeau government, like, if you go back, the finance minister, Bill Monroe, 3 weeks ago now, was saying day after day when there was all the oil price crashes and things. This is 3 weeks ago. Oh, we're working on a plan for the oil recovery. It's coming any minute now. It's going to be big and it's going to be awesome. And any day we'll come out with this amazing plan for the oil industry. And then 2 weeks went by, and they said nothing. And then Trudeau stands outside his house and says, we're putting billions of dollars into cleaning up wells. That's actually a pretty substantial shift. And it sucks, but the fact that that's what they came up with indicates that the other types of things and we've seen it because the oil industry lobby, their letter that they sent to the government was leaked. We know what they're asking for, and the government's not giving it to them. And I think this is my analysis, as I think that the Trudeau government may not have been addicted to the oil industry the way that the Harper government did. If you go back to the Harper government, they ran on this: we're going to get 5 pipelines built. Oil industry is going to save us. It's they're lovers in the night kind of thing. I think the Trudeau government their issue was actually more on the financing, that the 5 big banks in Canada are over leveraged in the oil industry in Canada, and that they were worried about a collapse of the banking sector because so much of those banks, those Canadian banks, have invested so heavily in the oil industry. And if you look at the last 5 years, all of the big multinational corporations that used to be mining and developing oil in Alberta have all left. And the only players that are there are all these like mid to small firms who have invested millions and billions of dollars into the industry, and they're hooped if they can't get profit out of it. Like they're just hooped, and because their whole business plan was that they would be selling oil for dozens of more years. So I think the Trudeau government, based off of what I'm seeing from their announcements, based off of the stuff that's coming out in the media, I think that they're kind of at this place where they have an opportunity now to actually walk their talk when it comes to climate, right? There's been all these lofty statements and photo ops and commitments. And I think that they're actually in a place now where they're like, okay, maybe they actually can walk the talk on this. And I think that there is some opportunity there, because I think that now is the opportunity for the movement to really hammer them on this, because they're going to be looking for real tangible things that help recover the economy. And they're going to look for safe ways to do that. And if the oil industry doesn't look like it's going to be the secure investment for the future, which it likely is not, we have a real opportunity right now. And I think this is a moment where the government's kind of psychology around oil might change. And I think I'm really excited about that piece of it.
It's a real actual fork in the road. It's like a big philosophical shift. Ananda, do you have any comments on that?
Sure. I actually share a lot of the optimism Councilman expressed around the opportunity, where I'm a bit more cynical, perhaps because of my years, and skeptical is around actually the Trudeau government. Trudeau's father was an architect of NAFTA. I think one of the things that we shouldn't underestimate is that there are much larger forces at play that are actually global forces that are both, that were created by the same culprits who have really tanked the economy, have brought the finance capital to its knees, and it's a really astute point you made about the banks being in collusion and in debt up to their knees with the oil and gas infrastructure up here. In our fights with the Chevrons, the Exxons, the Shells, and the ConocoPhillips globally, what I've always noted is that the neoliberal policy agreements, including the Paris Accord, because I think that's as much of a culprit as is the WTO and NAFTA in driving the false side of climate capitalism. But they're dictating, I think, for me, I see them dictating a lot of the terms of engagement for Trudeau or for whoever, his successor or future prime ministers. And so I go back to the old Frederick Douglass saying that power will not be conceded without struggle. And we need to actually, where I heard a lot of, I actually was eating up stuff you guys were saying, Brittany and Councilman, about organizing bottom up, because that's, I think, the big opportunity that we haven't tapped yet. If there's one thing we can learn from global social movements, is organizing. And unfortunately, I think part of what we need to do to organize against the oil and gas empires and their neoliberal trade policy agreements and their government shills, Trump's, Trudeau's, everyone in line, is figure out ways in which we really build power. And if anything, here in the Pacific Northwest, it had started back in the 70s and 80s, perhaps with the Mackenzie Valley pipeline fight, the first time a lot of, we were able to bridge some of the racialized barriers between movements and really look at not just strategic partnerships, but really common cause. And that's what we need to build. And that's, I think, will be the core formula to be able to build power bottom up to take on these powers. But we need to be willing to have some very difficult conversations. It's about us as organizers, us on the left being able to go out there and start talking to the miners, the loggers, the ranchers, the artificial, in the States, the artificial red-blue divides, and be able to bridge across the working class, especially where the deepest racialized divides exist. That's where we actually need to lean into and get rid of a lot of this colonial conflict averse culture that we as racialized peoples have sometimes adopted, to go, no, let's be willing to have the difficult conversations, put them on the table up front, locally, local government by local government, with local First Nations, with local unions, and with local bases, in a a very concerted effort to take back city by city, province by province, the power that we need to take back to actually turn the tables on those destroying the earth. And that's the only, I think, plausible way. I don't see federal policy shifts. Like, I mean, the Paris Accord was never set out to address climate justice or real climate solutions. And we have to acknowledge that and go, you know, those targets are meaningless. They don't meet our needs on the ground. We have to come up with our own. And that's where the diversity piece about local need is what is going to get us there. Because if we actually start designing economies to meet community need, what we'll find out is about 4 to 5 times as many jobs in meeting human need in terms of housing, food, shelter, energy, you know, clothing, transportation, than there is in the current resource extractive model.
Thanks, Anand. Brittany, do you have any comments on what you see as the future of the industry?
Yeah, I think any bailout to the oil and gas sector should not happen without a robust conversation on what Canada's just transition plan will be, and also when we will plan to meet our transition targets. So prior to the pandemic, I was actually hopeful that we would start having conversations around just transition moving into 2020 and onwards after the 2019 election. I was hopeful because a huge part of the last 4 years was primarily focused on carbon emissions, carbon pricing, getting that through, battling courts, provincial and federal government agreements, and it really, I think, robbed the opportunity of talking about how do we actually create, you know, a greener economy, a more sustainable economy for the future, as we're working towards lowering our carbon emissions. And we haven't had that national conversation in Canada as yet. Certain sectors have been having it. I know Blue Green Canada is really instrumental in leading those conversations. The Broadbent Institute is really instrumental. And then also there's been a number of community benefit agreements, I think, that have been great, accompanying oil and gas projects in regards to Indigenous communities. So those things have been, I think, great steps, but we haven't had a robust conversation around just transition. And I think one thing that's really great about the environmental movement is that it's really aspirational, you know, talking about the really big picture of the type of world we need to live in order to continue thriving on this earth as humans, but also doing so in a way that's healthy, and in a way that brings hopefully everyone, but a better planet for all. But I do think what the green movement is not so good at discussing is the here and now. So how do we do, what are the short interim measures that we need to do? And one of those is, if the oil and gas bailout is happening, yes, there absolutely needs to be, I would say, some advocacy coming from the green movement. But if that's happening, what are the conditions that should be attached to that? There should be robust climate targets attached to that, a robust, full thought out just transition plan accompanied with that. Like that those demands should be there on the table, and that's a here and now demand. So I would love to see some more here and in the now solutions as we're in the midst of actually rebuilding our economy. These opportunities don't come very often, right? And obviously it came through a very unfortunate circumstance, but it's here. And we have an opportunity to go down a very different path. So.
Thanks, Brittany. Yes, there was a question from one of the viewers that it will take radical change here, especially in places like Alberta, which is so dependent on oil and gas. And the question was, can people speak to the phases to transition? And I think you sort of touched on that, Brittany. Salem and Anna, do you have any comments on, you know, if this is the swan song of the oil and gas industry, or perhaps even a bailout? What does a transition even look like if we're going to be encouraging it for that short term? What is that first step in your view? Kilsillan?
Yeah, I think there's a confluence of things happening right now in the economy, right? So you're having a suppressed demand for oil, and you have the price wars going on between some of the oil producing nations, and they're really trying to choke out certain countries in terms of being able to invest infrastructure. Because if you're going to invest $10 billion or $20 billion into a pipeline or a mine, you're locking yourself into a certain level of revenue, assumed revenue, for a while. So I think it's just a confluence of issues that are arising now, and you'll see the conservative governments like Alberta is sort of going to throw billions of dollars at trying to bail out the oil industry, and it's crazy what they're trying to do. I think that the projects that have the potential to be supported are going to be a lot of energy, not renewable energy projects, a lot of construction-based things. There's also the whole issue around trees. As hippie as that sounds, trees are also like a huge part of the solution in terms of carbon sequestration, but not the capitalist kind of the carbon capture stuff, which is a bigger topic that I'm not a fan of. But yeah, so I think that there's going to be those types of projects and some of the retrofits and energy efficiency. These aren't like super attractive sounding things, but they're real. They're real policies that actually have an impact on the carbon reduction. But to tie it into, I think, some of the other important issues and in terms of equity, you know, there's stuff around who gets access to these programs and who's prioritized in these programs. You know, if there's going to be retrofits, if buildings are going to be redone and upgraded, what communities are actually getting that funding and getting that support? I've obviously critiqued cars a lot already, but still, if governments are going to focus on clean electric vehicles, federal and provincial governments are offering subsidies for people to purchase them. But again, you're offering subsidies to people who already have the capital and the credit to apply for more loans on vehicles, which is a particular class of people in our society are not prioritizing low-income people or frontline communities, people of color and things like that, to be able to access maybe a higher level of subsidy, or maybe subsidies are targeted to certain communities. And we've seen that in other jurisdictions like California. So I think that all of the policies that get invested, it's going to be a real task to understand how to apply an equity lens to that. And that's actually, I think, where government's going to screw up the most, because they're not trained for it. Bureaucrats within provincial and federal offices, like there's thousands of bureaucrats who are administering these programs and designing the programs, and we just don't have enough people in those places to really tell them how to do that properly. So that's going to be a challenge for us.
One thing I'd say is that in addition to other things that the green movement, or in my mind, there's different green movements. So the big environmental NGO sector, one thing that doesn't know what to do is to really negotiate hard. Something that the labor movement's always had more skill at. And as putting on my labor organizer hat, I'd say we cannot just roll over and just accept any bailout packet and start off from a compromise negotiating position to begin with. We have to actually really state upfront what we really need. If we really want to take the strongest action possible to stave off the worst impacts of climate change, while preparing, our communities to face future pandemics, because this is not the first one. This is just the first in the line of many. And when you think of its ties to the size of the forest fires and other crises that are waves that are headed our way, it's a lot of things that we need to prepare for. What you'll actually find, what's fascinating, is that the sectors we need to invest our just transition strategies in, ecosystem restoration, food sovereignty, affordable housing, public transportation, universal health care, areas where we should be nationalizing all the economic sectors. These should be public sector jobs run by communities, developed by communities, of the people, by the people, for the people, tailored to individual community need. That in that bottom-up, localized, democratic approach lie both not only the greatest greenhouse gas emissions reductions, also lie the greatest number of jobs. And we've kind of looked at this sector by sector, like ecosystem restoration. As an ex-tree planter, I know that even if we're going to plant with all the UN to corporate level funding that's going into reforestation, we can't, like my old tree planting friends out there who are actually planting on the island right now as essential workers are saying, hey, we don't have enough people to move forward with these programs. But I know that even if we did, and it's probably not being done right. But if the purpose of these restoration programs is to restore natural biodiversity that actually has a true capacity to capture carbon, not by turning biomass into fuel pellets and all the other bogus things that they have lined up right now, but in terms of real ecosystem restoration, we could probably take everyone from the extraction sector, oil, gas, and mining, put them to work, and we would still be 10 years behind in terms of catching up to real ecosystem resiliency and health needs. So just to put into perspective is, in meeting human needs, there's actually huge economic potential. We just need to free ourselves from the thinking that we need big corporations and big banks to run our economy for us.
Thanks. Sort of on that topic, continuing with this, what many people, including Greenpeace, want to avoid is the kind of bailouts we saw in the US in the 2008 financial crisis, when economic relief was funneled to these big businesses. And unfortunately, the mindset of these businesses, as we see, is appeasing shareholders as opposed, or filling their pockets, as opposed to what's better for our collective planet. And it's a mindset that we need to change, and there are economic rules that we need to unwrite. So with regards to that, Brittany, in the financial crisis at that time in 2008, big businesses were considered too big to fail while people lost their jobs and homes and pensions. How can we avoid making the same mistakes this time around in our Canadian context?
I think we need to invest quite heavily in our social security system. So we saw that employment insurance was inadequate as an appropriate response to those who've lost their jobs during this pandemic, and a new sort of emergency response had to be developed because there were just way too many gaps in that pre-existing system. We're seeing now that social assistance rates are very low. I mean, a lot of policymakers and policy analysts have known that for quite some time, but we're seeing how it doesn't allow people to meet their needs, and why an infusion of financial support is necessary in order to help people get through this emergency crisis scenario, right? And I think we don't know what it's going to be like right after this pandemic, and we also don't know what future crises may occur in the future. So I think it's really important to have a robust social security net that people can draw on when they need it, and to ensure that people can have their needs met when they do not have a job. And this social security net doesn't only include support for financial and income-based programs, it also includes universal pharmacare, right? So that people don't have to lose their prescription drug plans when they no longer have employment, and that people don't have to pay out of pocket for prescription drugs. It also includes mental health care, right? So how do we have, a strong delivery of mental health services for folks who need it? And that all contributes to our well-being. And then lastly, our food systems. I love the fact that Ananda touched on, local food systems and growing locally. I think right now we're seeing how important that is. Grocery stores, increases exposure right now, and they've definitely been the backbone of our livelihoods during this pandemic. But community gardens, right, are in a huge important part of growing locally, especially in urban centers. So how do we make sure that we're promoting that good quality food production that can get to people in a way that's not costly? And then also I have to talk about, just quite briefly, the North and Indigenous communities, like here in Northern Ontario, and especially in the territories, how much it costs to transport food to these regions, and how how risky it is right now to transport goods in different parts of the country, and how that can even put people in those regions at further risk. So again, local food production, I think it's really important. So that's all a part of our social security net. So making sure that people have something to fall back on, and that they're not left in destitute when they need to draw on those services.
Thanks. Salem, what are some of the most innovative green stimulus or recovery proposal that you've seen gaining momentum? For example, like in the clean tech sector or responsible business development. I know you touched on some of these ideas, when you were talking about alternative transportation, or I know you had mentioned something else that slipped my mind at this time on a Friday night, but just, yeah, with regards to those innovative ideas you've seen, like cooperatives, renewable cooperatives, and things like that.
Yeah, it's a big question. There's a lot, and it depends on your personal philosophy around certain industries and whether you think they're acceptable or whatnot. But like, there's lots of industries that are becoming green, but they're not necessarily thought of as green because they're not like clean tech industries and things like that, right? So, for example, in Vancouver, we're seeing a huge expansion in tech jobs. They're not related to renewable energy or things like that. But when you're trying to increase the amount of jobs that exist within the country, you're trying to increase wages, you're trying to get people to provide people with meaningful incomes. You have to think, okay, what industries are going to provide that? And there's huge issues there in terms of, I think, a huge opportunity for some of the allyship around organizing the labor of that workforce. But it's an example of an industry that's low emission on the carbon side. It's not an expansion of oil and gas. It's not an expansion of industries that are expanding emissions. So it's, there's if you're trying to achieve a certain solution, which is the carbon emissions problem, then that's the solution. The other stuff that's coming out, I think a lot of it is around clean energy, and there's a lot of stuff around renewables. I think that there's some interesting things happening on the construction front around biofuels and the technology around that. So specifically using like bio waste to produce like natural gas. That's different from like fracking or liquefied natural gas. This is like recycling in an innovative way to produce natural gas through biofuels. And there's actually some really interesting advancements there. There's some really neat stuff happening around, I talk about construction a lot because I do it a lot for work, but I guess the last one is around mass timber. BC is changing the regulations on the height restrictions for building mass timber. Mass timber is a wood product that is basically like plywood, but thicker and denser and flame retardant or flame proof. And building structurally, they've figured out a way to build higher, so you can build up like 15 stories using wood. And the reason that that's fascinating is that one of the biggest parts of emissions from the construction industry is in cement. Cement is globally one of the biggest producers of carbon emissions. And so if you can get buildings onto something like wood, which does not produce as much emissions in the production of it, then you're reducing emissions pretty significantly. And I can't remember the exact number per floor or whatever, but it's pretty massive. And when you can build sustainable forest plans, which are possible by protecting old growth forests and responsibly managing and growing, we could have local jobs, local economies producing mass timber facilities and products, and then building an economy internal. Instead of right now in BC, we're shipping a lot of raw logs internationally to other markets for very cheap, when those can be turned into value-added jobs. And so I think that there's opportunities there. And it's going to be, I think part of it is that the government can do a lot of work on investing in innovation and research to understand what those new technologies, and those, not technologies, but just innovations in these areas that can come through. And then I think that we just have to look at, like, we can look at the policy level, the technical level of what are the industries and how much are they emitting and where, and what's the alternative? Is there a way we can shift that? And there's a lot of really cool stuff that's happening. And then it's all interconnected, right? So you got to think about energy efficiency as well. So can we reduce the amount of energy that each household needs? So then we're not having to try and figure out how to build all of the energy needs that we're going to need, right? So there's things like that as well that I think are important.
Thank you. One of the pressing questions that we have, I want you to, wrap us up if there's anything you have on that, but there's an outstanding question I'm getting a lot of pings about, is all of your views on universal basic income, which could take up an entire section on its own. But I know there's different views. So if you want to wrap us off in terms of this bailout conversation of, you know, those next steps of what the government should do, and then each of you give your quick little pitch about yay, nay, maybe, why not. We'll just keep a quick soundbite because I know this is a big area of discussion. Great, I'll just turn it over to Ananda.
I'll just say universal basic income works. There's enough evidence, and I can cite all the studies and stuff. But rather than get into that, I think there's on the solution side, and I really appreciate what Salem said. It's been the unfulfilled dream of many of us who have worked in the forest industry for years. When we first started talking about just transition back in the 80s, we imagined community-based forestry that had value-added sectors that really concentrated the wealth in the community, help to restore the biodiversity, restore the natural, you know, systems that we need desperately to support not only us, but the salmon we eat, you know, all the wildlife that it supports, because all of that has intrinsic value that does improve the quality of our lives. And how do we shift our thinking away from the material economy, where you have a choice of, you know, changing your iPhone every 2 years, to going, hey, I'm actually going to focus on nutrition and health. You know, and I'd rather eat better food for the next 2 years than have a new iPhone. I'd rather my entire family that there's adequate healthcare for all. And I think in this opportunity, there's not only just endless solution pathways and very small community scale examples that are tried and tested. We have to kind of learn, I think, a certain amount of systems analysis is being able to put on the bullshit detectors, because the corporations are going to come at us with 1,000 different false solutions. And how do we filter those out? And when I talk to communities, I say, well, look at cost first. If it's going to cost more than your community can afford, if you're going to have to go to CIBC for a loan, it's probably not the right solution. If it's going to require an input of a product that comes from another country, it's probably not the right solution. So how do we create those filters and assessment tools? And I think in that, there's one of the things that I've on the design side, one of the things that we're asking, because I work with a network called the Labor Network of Sustainability, and we're leaning into these just transitional learning tools, where we're asking community groups to partner with local unions and actually have conversations of what should the future look like given the current moment. And one of the first question that comes out the gate is, what are your immediate needs? And the second question that I usually ask is, given the situation, how should we redesign our society differently so we're better prepared the next time? And with our healthcare system, one of the most obvious things that no one wants to talk about because it's too big a challenge is, how do we decentralize healthcare? Because we are unfortunately incubating between the EU and North America, the hospitals themselves are incubating the virus and contagion at rates that are unbelievable. Without proper testing and contact tracing, we're making a mess. Whereas we could actually provide better full-time employment to caregivers, to doctors, nurses, and other caregivers in communities if we decentralize the system, to be able to both track contagion and actually be able to understand how we learn to coexist with these viruses, not kill it, because we don't want to go to war. And that's actually another fundamental design flaw. We think about fighting, going to war against stuff that kills us. How do we look at it differently? How do we look at it as what caused it, and how do we address its root systemic causes so that future viruses like this don't pop up in the way that they have? So I guess embedded in that, I would say there's a lot of design thinking where we need to decolonize our minds to be able to think locally, to look to traditional and other forms of knowledge where dominant culture knowledge systems have not served us in all these sectors, and everything from least cost planning in energy to food sovereignty principles in food production. There are other ways that I think movements have started articulating new systemic analyses and frameworks that we need to look to. And finally, it's on the political front, groups in the US are calling for a general strike on May Day. I think that's something we need to push. If we want to actually have the political power to take on, to push back against the bailouts of the banks and the fossil fuel companies, let's put up our own strong positions and say, hey, there's an opportunity for us to actually engage in all forms of creative general strike while we're calling for solidarity and protection of those most vulnerable and the frontline workers, and actually leaning into both worker rights and into directions that those workers can see a sustainable future for themselves, and get out of the false binaries of jobs versus environment, and get into a more logical political binary of community need versus corporate greed. So I'd say I'm putting those out there as big picture frames, but I think that's what we need to actually guide then a lot of our strategy, in response to this. The other, the people's bailout is the other counter messaging. I think that it would be useful for us to adopt here, but as part of that people's bailout, two of the platform pieces that have been discussed. One is the social safety nets that Brittany referred to earlier. Like, how do we institutionalize that deeper and localize those social safety nets? And the second piece is universal basic income, because it's not just the essential services today that once again communities need to decide what's essential and what's not, but it's actually all the invisibilized labor. How do we truly create what some would call a feminist economy? Let's actually start paying for the childcare, for the care of our elders, for the care of our sick, all the labor chores that are underpaid, not even recognized, invisibilized in many cases, and lean into those areas and go, okay, that is actually an economy. Well, let's start with that. How do we compensate those who have been caring for our children, without any recognition all these years? So yes, and it's again bottom up with those who are poorest amongst us.
Thank you so much. Okay, we're gonna wrap up soon. It's getting late, but a couple of quick questions. I just want a quick fire answer, a tweet-like answer from Salem, and then Brittany. Oh, do you have something to say, Salem? Go ahead.
I mean, if I was to say tweet, I'm not a fan of universal basic income, but I mean, I think it's obviously a big conversation. I'll just say this, that I'm somewhat, I guess, passively opposed or agnostic. I'm not actively opposed to it. It's more that I am skeptical and concerned, very worried about the progressive left adopting it as a plank policy position, particularly because of how ineffectual, if we're to be honest with ourselves, how ineffectual the movement has been at even winning simple battles on things like income assistance, affordable housing, a lot of the other social safety nets, and Brittany raised that earlier. We've been very ineffectual, and we've had to sustain multiple conservative governments who have undermined and deteriorated it. And so I am worried about the political economy that starts to exist when we do a new universal basic income. And I also don't know what other policy solutions are out there and what we're trying to achieve with it. And so I think it's not so much that I'm just worried that it's a little bit, it might need a little bit more thinking, and I want to have a more fulsome understanding of what are all the solutions and what are the issues we're trying to address. And I'm honestly worried that people are jumping on with a slogan, universal basic income, without understanding what that really means, what the cost is, and how much that cost plays with other types of asks that we have in terms of improving the social safety net. And there's lots of stuff that needs to be renegotiated around the social safety net, because when the social safety net was created, there were things in our society that didn't exist then. And so when we talk about creating universality for certain services and certain basic requirements of our society today, some of that needs to also be a part of that conversation. Things like internet, for example, and other services that can become universal. So the housing is another. So
it's a big universal basic income is a big conversation. Brittany, do you want to wrap up on that?
Yeah, just to quickly add, it's interesting because a UBI or universal basic income might seem like on the surface as if it's a collective response to the policy problem or the problem that we're trying to solve, but it's actually very individualistic. And it gives people the money they need, but then kind of says, like, you have the money that you should need to survive, now go off and live. And I don't think it accounts for the fact that a lot of people need a variety of different supports in order to thrive and live healthy and good lives. I think it doesn't account for the fact that not everyone needs a basic income. And there's this idea that we can tax it back later, but why? Why tax it back later when we don't have to? So I'm actually not opposed to a basic income for low income folks. For those who may not be able to enter into the labor market for a variety of reasons, I'm not opposed to that. I do, however, have concerns around a basic or universal income for all. And I think some good questions to ask is, what is the problem we're trying to solve? How does a UBI actually achieve that? And how does that interfere or impact other social supports and services that many people rely on? Is there a likelihood that the money that's going into universal basic income, will that starve our public infrastructure, whether that's transit, whether that's employment supports, community supports? There's a whole infrastructure that's funded right now by government. So there is those conversations that need to be accounted for. And I am of the belief that not everybody needs government money. And I think we need to acknowledge that. So I would love, I love the idea of a basic income for low income folks to raise their income levels to meet that of what would be required to thrive in society and to afford the basic necessities that everyone should have a right to have. But I do have reservations that I had mentioned earlier.
Yeah, this is a big topic on its own. And I'm sure that whoever's watching and is interested, there are a lot of resources and discussions about it. And maybe these panelists will go on to speak more about it in other conversations. Just a couple of things. I just wanted to ask you, each of you, sitting here at home, we're just trying to take care of our own health, take care of people around us. What's one piece of advice you'd give to people of what they can do, like a very small thing that's tangible that people can do, just basically sitting at home? And then how can we be better allies in the community, to frontline workers and people in racialized communities and marginalized communities who need to be in the focus of this lens? And then finally, well, there's one more after this, but what is normal to you? What is going back to normal? I know it's a three-parter. I'm just trying to wrap up here. It's getting late, but so the questions are, what is the one thing someone can do? How can you be a better ally? And what is normal to you? Going back after this, we're saying, let's get back to normal. What is normal? Brittany.
Very, very quick. So in terms of, oh my gosh, the first question, it blanked me.
That's okay. No, it's what can you do? Like, what's the one thing you tell people?
So I'm really big on mental health right now. And I think what's really important is accessing and knowing what mental health supports are out there. A few off the bat, Bounce Back is available in almost every province. If you need support, access it. The federal government announced a mental health portal of some sort for users who may be struggling in this moment in time. I think it's really important to access supports if you need it. Another one, and also sharing these supports with other folks as well. Another thing, what does normal look like to me? Normal looks like to me, I think because my work is constantly thinking through ways to insert a more progressive vision and approach to society, I think normal would be thinking about implementation. All of us thinking about implementation. And I know that doesn't directly answer your question, but I see normal as all of us engaging in acts of social change or working towards social change. I would personally like that. And another more, I guess, casual thing to say is normal is spending time with my family and my friends. I think that's really important, and I'm really looking forward to doing that once this pandemic is over. I mean, I've always cherished the time with them, but I have a renewed appreciation for in-person time. So, yeah.
Thank you. Ananda? You're on mute.
Hi, thanks. Well, this has been an excellent conversation. I'd say one thing you can do if you do not already have an affinity group, a collective, a team, a union, or a group that you can turn to work together with, form one. Find 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 friends and form a team that you can collectivize with. That you could, figure out ways in which you can work together and start collaborating, because I think that's the building block of change for me. In our movements, we say movements are built at the pace of trust. So to me, movements are family. Look to your family, look to those friends who are closest to you and see how you could work together. And in this moment, find small things you could do to make life not only better for yourselves, but those around you who may need your help. In that vein, I think there's what's really brilliant about this moment. Two of the huge opportunities that have come up is that mutual aid networks, caremongering networks, solidarity networks have been set up faster than governments and agencies have been able to respond to this crisis. And that's really quite brilliant. I mean, so, the mutual aid Vancouver network, every city I think has one now. Plug into that, because I think what it allows us to do is create the alternative institutions that will someday become formalized, that are right now are those grounds where we can practice collaboration, practice new ways of decision making and helping each other that future generations will need. And finally, the biggest opportunity, I mean, Mother Earth right now has a breather. I mean, the fact that the economy slowed down, they're predicting by the end of this year we'll see a greater reduction in greenhouse gas emissions than all the economic than the drops in greenhouse gas emissions in all the last 50 years of economic recessions combined. That's significant. How do we lean into this moment and lean into the direction that Mother Earth needs to for us to lean into? If we start thinking about shift the thinking away from what do I need to what the Earth needs, I think that therein lies the bigger policy direction and strategy direction and movement direction that everyone could benefit from. Check.
Thanks. And Salem, what's the one thing someone can do, and how can they be a better ally, and what is normal? 3 in 1.
Okay, my advice all the time when it comes to allyship is be prepared to make a mistake. We're all gonna fuck up.
Yes, absolutely.
So just go into it. Wake up today being like, I want to help support Indigenous people. I want to help support women. I want to help support immigrants. I want to help support Black people, aid, solidarity, whatever it is. And just be like, I'm going to commit to this practice and I'm probably going to make a mistake. And making a mistake is not the problem. It's what you do after you make the mistake that's the problem. So just figure that out. I'm trying to be really condensed here. So
No problem.
normal. I mean, selfishly, I'm like a self-described extrovert. This is this has been challenging for me. I really miss. I think somebody mentioned visiting family, friends. I have done more virtual dates than I've ever done in my life. So I would like to go back to in-person dating if possible. So that's a couple of normal things at a personal level that I think is real. And I'll end it on one other note, though, in terms of normal, that I think touches on a point that I often make, which is I would say that the progressive left has, over the last number of decades, really abandoned economic analysis as a part of the base of our politics. We've reduced that as the base of our politics and have replaced it with other types of focus, which are important, but we've lost that, I think, the economic analysis piece. And what I mean by that is that when you have when the broad conversation amongst most people who are part of that movement or part of that political philosophy can actually articulate and understand economic analysis. And where I would say is the normal, this is why I want to get to it, the normal is we are seeing stores closing and probably never going to open, restaurants closing, never going to open. We're going to see arts and cultural spaces close that might not ever open. These are all benefits of a booming economy. when we have an economy that is growing in the number of jobs, growing in the number of wages, growing in the number of businesses, successful people. I have a lot of people, friends and people I know in Vancouver have small businesses who employ 10, 15 people, 5, and they're shut down and they might not open. And all those jobs are lost. And those aren't big corporate jobs. Those are local economy jobs, serving our people. And I think a booming economy is part of what we had before. We've unilaterally shut our economy down. This isn't a recession like a collapse of the financial market or some of the other recessions that we've seen. This is like we've unilaterally shut ourselves down because we've had to, and it's smart. It's the right thing to do. But I think normal for a while now has been a quite successful economy in different parts of the country. That economy has not served everybody well, and it has not been perfect. But I think we would much rather fight for progressive changes in a booming economy than in a recession, because a recession means that the right-wing politics and framing has a better chance of winning. They're saying, hey, we've spent a lot of money. We need to start making some cuts now. Where do they go? Social safety net programs. So I think that I'm raising this because I think that we need to get more comfortable as a progressive left talking about economic and controlling the narrative around economic issues, and that stop ceding that to the right. Because when the elections happen, the right-wing candidates, they all talk about economy, jobs, but we know from a fact that the best economic managers at a provincial level in this country, the best governments who have ever run their country's finances the best, have always been New Democrat governments. Ontario, Manitoba, BC, consistently, Saskatchewan. There's a couple of exceptions to the rule, but there's comparisons between Liberal and Conservative governments at provincial levels and how well they run their finances versus New Democrats. So I think that's an example of what we need to do to control the narrative and normal.
Thank you. So I lied. This is the very, very last question before we wrap up for tonight. If you had a tweet, it's a tweet-based question, so it has to be short. If you had a tweet that says green recovery is, how would you fill that in for the rest of the tweet? And that's how we're going to end this evening. If you need a second or two to think about it, I'll pass it over to Brittany first. So if you had to do a tweet, green recovery is, how would you fill that in?
Green recovery is about supporting people to get there.
Thanks. Ananda? You're on mute.
Green recovery is meeting community need, not corporate greed.
And finally, Salem.
Oh, this is so hard for me. Green recovery is transformative.
Great.
Sorry.
Thank you. I know that's a bigger answer, and there's questions of what is green recovery. So if you want to know more, please follow these people however you would follow them on social media or through their websites or through their work, through their writing. That information will be available to be able to try to engage more in a dialogue with them and see what they have on their views are on a green recovery. Also visit the Greenpeace website to find out what Greenpeace is saying about a green recovery. We're going to provide the links in the description of the live stream. Thank you so much to everybody who's been watching. I've never done one of these before, so it's kind of nerve-wracking and it's late. I know it's late on a Friday, so thank you for hanging in there. And thank you so much to these panelists for a terrific dialogue. I know it's winding, but all of these issues are so interconnected. It's hard to separate and sort of compartmentalize these questions. So appreciate you.
You're a really good moderator.
Thank you very much. Thank you. All right. Well, have a good night, everybody, and take care of yourselves.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.